Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast exploring the deep interconnections between personal wellness, societal challenges, and spiritual growth. Hosted by Dr. Jeff Armstrong, this thought-provoking series tackles the big questions. How do we cultivate a well-centered life in a world that often feels unbalanced? What role does spirituality play in solving today's personal and collective problems? Drawing from concepts of well-centered fitness, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social wellness, we bring you engaging conversations with experts, thinkers, and everyday people who challenge us to rethink our approaches to health, happiness, and harmony. Together, we uncover solutions to life's problems that start within. Our guest is Dr. Asim Desai, a Stanford-trained cardiac electrophysiologist, author, and speaker, specializing in heart rhythm disorders and advanced catheter ablation techniques. With over 2 decades of experience, he integrates heart health with mental well-being, focusing on the stress response and autonomic nervous system. As co-director of Mission Heritage Heart Rhythm Specialist and former faculty at the University of Chicago, he advances patient care and advocates for physician mental health, teaching mindfulness to healthcare providers. Dr. Desai is the author of Restart Your Heart, the Playbook for Thriving with AFib, and writes the Mindful Beats column in Psychology Today, exploring the brain-heart connection. He is also a contributing writer for Thrive Global and Kevin MD. Dr. Desai, welcome to this new podcast, this new adventure I'm taking, and hopefully a lot of people will take with us this concept of we have a spiritual problem. I just want to kind of dive into things because I know when you were on my Aging Well podcast, you alluded to, a lot of spiritual aspects, and I know that it was stuff that just seemed like it was wanting to come out of you, and I think we both wanted to take the conversation in that direction, and so now we have that opportunity to do that. So I welcome you to the podcast, and I want to just start off by having you describe your spiritual or philosophical perspective and how this has shaped your world.
It's great to be here, Jeff. I'm very excited about the conversation. And you and I were talking a little bit about before we started the recording that I think so much of people's connection to spirituality, and whether you want to use the word God or you want to use sort of a nondescript word or any kind of religious faith or belief system, so much of it for the individual is based on trauma, pain, loss, people trying to make sense of some of the challenges of life. And so quite commonly, you'll see people who are faced with a major illness, who are trying to make sense of their own mortality. And as people approach death, trying to kind of uncover ideas of what happens to the body? Is there a soul? So for me, I think, when I was 3, my dad had a heart attack and I woke up in the next door neighbor's guest room. I mean, it was quite shocking. I mean, I have these sort of scant memories of it, but I do distinctly remember sort of this light coming on and me being in this unfamiliar bed and seeing the sort of shape in the doorway. And I think, I'm fascinated with the science of trauma. And I think that probably planted a seed within my brain somewhere about safety and how life is so fragile, and we assume this level of safety that we have, even though the reality is that there's very little that we can control. And then I sort of grew up with typical Indian parents of the generation. They were kind of emotionally, let's just say, not fully, in tune with their kids. Are wonderful parents. They provided sort of from a financial security standpoint, our education, et cetera. But there was definitely something missing. And I think some of it had to do with my dad. And when he had that heart attack, he saw himself as fragile and just didn't participate, sort of in life. And this happens to a lot of heart patients. And he was a doctor himself. He was an oncologist. But I did grow up seeing a spiritual side to my parents, and in particular my dad. I remember seeing him in his office in these deep meditative prayers. And I grew up in a Hindu household. So, a lot of people have the misunderstanding that Hinduism is sort of polytheistic and there's no one God that's believed in. What I was taught growing up is that sometimes these different gods that you see in Hinduism and probably other spiritual traditions are just really meant to be ways in which we can better understand and make sense of God's attributes. And so I saw dad as still very much believing in one God. And a lot of times the guru or the teacher that Indians have is sort of their path to getting connected with God. So he introduced me at a young age to sort of quote unquote my guru, even though this is like sort of a priest or a man that I didn't even speak the same language, but there was this kind of, he was like a holy man. So I grew up in that sort of tradition, and I remember going into college and kind of, and I find God has somewhat of a sort of humor to him. And I remember when I was dating a woman who was my first wife in college, I wasn't that into Hinduism. I didn't know much about it, but her family was quite Orthodox. And so for very shallow reasons, I learned about Hinduism in order to sort of be indoctrinated in the family and kind of be a part of that culture. And then it turned out that I found it really fascinating. And so that was kind of my path. And then when I went to med school, and again, I kind of probably went into medicine for the wrong reasons in the beginning to please my father. That was a typical thing that Indian kids did. They sort of were expected to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer, or something of that sort. That he died in middle medical school. He had a cardiac arrest, and it was in India, and it was horrific. And I still remember the day that I got a call, like 4 a.m. I was getting ready to take my pharmacology exams the next day, and it was this sort of surreal experience that out of nowhere, he was visiting his sister in India who had a stroke, and out of nowhere, I sort of got this call. And I remember a few minutes before the call, which came from my uncle, feeling this sort of voice or this vibratory, it wasn't even a voice. It was just this general vibration in my apartment, in my dorm at Northwestern Chicago. And I didn't really think much of it, but then I got the call. And then I remember my uncle said, your dad's very sick. You have to come to India right away. And then I rushed home. I didn't live far from my home in Chicago when I was living downtown at Northwestern. And I remember getting home and sort of breaking into the filing cabinet in his office to try to retrieve my passport. And then my brother called, and my brother said, they actually lied to us. Our relatives lied to us. They wanted to protect us. Dad's not sick. He's actually dead. And I remember just my whole world just shattering. I couldn't even make sense of it. And so, like many people who are called to just do it and compartmentalize and push through it because something needs to get done. And in this particular case, I needed to get to India. I needed to help my mom. We needed to perform the funeral rites. All of these things needed to get done and then deal with his estate afterwards. There was no time to process. There was no time for grief. And in fact, when I got there, I distinctly remember there was this sort of coldness to the whole culture. They had him laying in this ambulance, and they had my brother and I just walk into the ambulance and meet our dead father on the gurney. It was just this horrific, traumatic experience. And it was sort of just expected that you would kind of just take this on. And I just remember having a lot of anger in particular at that time, never really thinking that those kinds of experiences, those traumas, would shift into some type of post-traumatic growth. And so as time went on, I ended up evolving from a kid who went into medicine for the wrong reasons to then becoming a cardiologist that saves people from sudden cardiac death, which is what my dad died of, and not really even thinking about it. And so that's where I sort of get back to the idea of for me, God began as a very abstract concept. And then what shifted over time was my movement towards Christianity. And I think in particular, I was drawn to the idea of a father-son relationship, which is something that I had missed growing up. And then, of course, when dad was kind of ripped out of our lives, there was the loss of a father. And so over time, I went through sort of very dark periods of depression. And that's where I think I still remember this one day I was taking call days in a row. This is back in a time where there wasn't a lot of regulation over doctors taking calls. So we were expected to be up for 36 hours straight. And it wasn't until there were some major medical errors that occurred in our country that sort of people figured out you can't have doctors stay up that long for long periods of time. So at that time, I was my body was being abused. My mind was being sort of abused by the system. And I remember coming home and having nothing left. And I fell to my knees at my home in California. And without even thinking about it, I remember looking up and just screaming out loud, God, why have you forsaken me. Like, not even thinking like those were the words of Jesus Christ on the cross. I must have heard them somewhere, but there was this sort of evolution in me, I think personally, of trying to make sense of my life, trying to make sense of the loss of my father, trying to make sense of some of the mental health crises that I went through. And then I think that was the personal side, and needing a God to help me navigate pain and help me navigate, sort of doubts of like why. And you and I were talking about this before I came on, that sometimes doubt is a necessary part of faith. And then faith is sort of the belief in something that you can't prove. And fundamentally, scientists, such as myself, as a physician scientist, we need proof. We need p-values. We need large randomized trials to prove efficacy of medications or surgical intervention. And God is definitely not something you talk about at medical conferences. But I remember just taking care of patients over the years and seeing, in particular, there was a patient just actually recently, this was just a few months ago, and it was again a horrific situation where I had done the procedure on this patient of mine. It was called a Watchman, which is where we put a little filter into the heart to prevent clots from traveling to the brain in a condition called atrial fibrillation. And I remember the procedure went great. I've known her for like over 15 years. I've known her husband really well for over 15 years, really great guy. And I remember that she was to see me for the post-op visit. And I remember being in a patient's room in my office, and she didn't show up for the appointment. Normally she's really good about that. And shortly after that, there was all this commotion in the building. And everyone said, oh, someone's family member got hit by a car in the parking lot. And sooner, basically within the next 15 minutes, someone came from her friend circle, came into the office, kind of rushing in the office and said, Dr. Desai, can you come with us? So it turns out that her husband was dropping her off for the appointment with me, and he was actually run over by a car right in front of our office building. A woman who was grabbing a ticket had hit the accelerator instead of the brake. And it was a horrible, tragic situation. I remember they brought me into the urgent care. They tried to resuscitate him. They took him over to the emergency room, but he was already dead on arrival. But they took the wife, my patient, to the urgent care, which was in our building, in the hospital just up the street. He was covered with scrapes and bruises. And I remember walking into that room, and I usually hold my composure pretty well, but when my eyes met her eyes, I just like sort of broke down in tears. I remember like some of the first words out of her mouth was, he's in a better place. Now, some of the skeptics in the audience who are listening may say something like, well, this is just a human coping mechanism to make sense of loss, or if he was in shock or any of those things. But she has persisted in that. And I think that, again, it kind of gets back to, and you asked the initial question for me of like, what led me to spiritual connection and sort of exploring this. And I think it's the pain and the loss and the trauma within myself, making sense of it. And I think what you see in patients and what you see in some people and how they go down the route of post-traumatic stress and spiral down. And then when you see, why do some people actually have post-traumatic growth? And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But I think for many, that's why people turn to spiritual traditions. And some people are just sort of born into it. They're born Catholic, they're born Muslim, and I remember hearing something about the scientists having a debate, and in the end, like they sort of went through the Socratic method, and in the very end, they couldn't explain everything in science in observed phenomenon with scientific method. And in the end, they had to admit, and there's a lot of this stuff you see in Christian theology about the push for existence of God. And one of them is all the things that you see around you, all the amazing things in nature, the way the universe works together, or even within our bodies, how there's just massive cellular intelligence and how we originate from one cell and how this sort of differentiates into tissues and into organs, into systems. Like, how is any of that possible? Is it random? Is it chance? And so there's this sort of nerdy intellectual side of me that's trying to wrestle with that too. And I think, I'm not unique in that. I think this happens for a lot of people. And so I think now I was talking to someone the other day. I think, people wouldn't argue with the fact that there's something fundamentally happening in the world, in the planet, in human beings right now, that whether it's the recent elections in the US whether it's the conflicts around the world, whether it's the tremendous amount of climate crisis that we see. But there is some kind of tension, there is something building. And, you hear about people that kind of take the ultimate the radical religious view of this is the end of times. And then you have some people that kind of say, well, we need to figure out a way to work together. But I think the podcast that you're having here, I think one of its kind of points of discussion, and like you and I were talking about, trying to have different guests on that explore different viewpoints of what's happening and what does spirituality really mean? Does it mean, a connection to something greater than yourself? And I think where we get really bogged down is in words. Like, words divide us. When you use words like Jesus or Krishna or Allah or any of these words that people use to connect to something bigger, then people get that's where the conflicts happen. When in reality, scientists and spiritual leaders, in some ways, most human beings are kind of talking about some similar concepts of feeling alone and feeling disconnected, trying to make sense of things. And spirituality is one way of doing it. And I think most importantly is life and all of these aspects are found in the gray, that it's not an either or. It's not, is there God? Is there not God? I think we as human beings are meant to live in this tension and continue to live in this tension between opposites. And how do you make sense of when there's tremendous suffering in the planet? How do you make sense that a God actually exists? And so I think I was just reading about something this morning, that there are many parts in the Bible that feature people who have had a lot of doubts, including King David in particular, and all the Psalms that were written that are really about kind of turning to God and almost having these sort of angry discussions or these points of pain and saying, like, why have you turned yourself away from me? Or even Jesus on the cross having those doubts. And I think that that's where, to some degree, we are meant to live, in that tension. So, I look forward to continued episodes on your podcast that kind of explore that tension, because I think that's, as long as we continue to have the conversations amongst ourselves, as long as we continue to interact with God, or whatever you want to say, as a point of just not full acceptance. There has to be a level of mystery. There has to be a level of uncertainty, because that's the way life is. And that I've heard people phrase that certainty can sometimes, almost to some degree, I mean, this is kind of extreme, but be considered, I wouldn't say a sin, but certainty is dangerous, because certainty you see in political ideologies, you see in nations that fight each other, this sort of dogmatic belief. And I think we have to keep ourselves open to other viewpoints, because I think that's just kind of how life is to some degree. So, long answer to your question, but I hope it opened up some kind of points of
that's great. I'm kind
conversation.
of looking through some of the different questions I wanted to ask you today, and I'm like, I think he's already answered that one already, and everything else. But you were talking about kind of the duality of faith. I don't know if you were talking about it as we recorded, or if it was kind of before we started recording, but kind of that duality that kind of fascinates you a bit. And as you were talking about doubt, I think of that, not a disconnect, but the dual connection between the need for doubt and the kind of a negative side of doubt when it comes to faith. And I was thinking, as you were talking about that, a friend many years ago pointed out that in Matthew, Jesus gives the four enemies of faith: fear, doubt, anxious care, and human reasoning, and doubt being one of those. But at the same time, we need that doubt to build the faith and to build that trust. And so we need kind of that duality. We need that tension in our lives in order to really drive us in the spiritual direction. And so when you think of a spiritual problem, what does that mean to you? The title of this podcast is we have a spiritual problem. And it kind of arises from a conversation I had with another guest on my other podcast that said, we don't have this particular problem, we have a spiritual problem. And I'm like, wow, that would be a great conversation for another podcast. And so here we are. So what do you hear when you hear the phrase, we have a spiritual problem?
I think let's break that down. So what does spiritual mean, or what does spirit mean? And so I think most would agree that it is something intangible, that it is something that perhaps makes us uniquely human. It's something that it's like, whether it's a life essence or a soul, there is something, even scientists would probably agree, that is within us that is not fully something that you can touch or absorb or feel. And so I think that, and then you look at like, what does the word problem mean? A problem is a challenge or a tension. And so if you were to use one word to describe the world right now and people, it would be disconnection. So the tension here is that you have something like social media and technology, which is designed to bring people together as one goal. But then you have algorithms and you have ideologies that split people apart. And now you have this whole thing of like AI versus humanity. And I think the idea of a spiritual problem is we feel disconnected from ourselves, that there is almost you have families, like people within families, that are fundamentally divided because of political ideologies or even religious ideologies. And so there is a disconnection that people are forgetting, that we are fundamentally human and that we share. There is so much more in common that we have with each other than how we're different. So I think the spiritual problem to me means internally we're disconnected from ourselves, from our sense of purpose, from our sense of humanity and love and compassion, that we are disconnected from each other, largely either through just the nature of being human, but also what technology has done. And I think the nature of a spiritual problem has to be tied to the nature of truth, because I think that that's where a lot of tension has occurred, is in what is truth. And as you have technology develop and you have the ability that within nanoseconds to put out information onto the planet that other people will see, and how to validate that truth. And when you have all these different opinions that come together, like how do you actually make sense of what's true? And then you have the disconnection to a larger force, whether it's humanity, you want to call it that, or whether it's God, but there's a disconnect with God. So I think that and the way it manifests is with conflict. So people had internal conflict. If you want to call that, the representation of that is massive amounts of anxiety and depression, and the epidemic of that, especially amongst our teens. If you want to talk about it being between nations and war. But the other thing is that, we always think like, we're in this conflict, we're in this spiritual problem, this tension. But the reality is like we're not alone. Like, this is not the first time in history that this has happened. And this has happened, some people say, in cycles over the time of evolution. The only difference is that we have much less to worry about in terms of physical threat. People aren't dying with high infant mortality rates. There's not major problems with infectious disease worldwide, at least post-pandemic. And that really what we're dealing with now are these sort of existential tensions, these anxieties of things that have not yet happened, these fears that we have, that parts of our brain are activated. And we are dealing with, I think, fear of the unknown and fear of uncertainty. That's one of the fundamental, our bodies and our brains are designed to be wired for certainty. And so we're very uncomfortable with uncertainty, and whether that comes in the form of interacting with other people or not understanding things, or whether that's the uncertainty about life and death. But I think that, when you say we have a spiritual problem, I'm not sure if that's a new thing. I think it's something that has happened through millennia. It's just that it's different now. The spiritual problem now we have different it's more subtle, and it's almost like a cancer, because it's very difficult to detect that when you find yourself feeling unease or you feel unsettled, sometimes it's very difficult to pin down what that is. And I'm not saying that people who are spiritual necessarily have something figured out than people who are not. I think that's problematic when you say that, because even saying we have a spiritual problem makes an assumption that the people that are having the discussion are spiritual. And I think what we really have is a fundamental problem of communication and connection and disconnection. And so to me, spiritual means that you're thinking about things and you're connected about things that are outside of your own individual worldview, that you need to have a broader, sort of more cognitively flexible view of the world. And I think that that's the problem that we have, is that we tend to be sort of living in these individual silos. And the pandemic didn't help. I mean, pandemic was probably one of the greatest social science experiments of like what happens to human beings when they're physically separated. You have more conflict, you have more internal conflict, you have more external conflict, and you have this sort of disintegration of society. I mean, you saw so much more anger and all of these terrible things that are happening in the world. And so I think that the fundamental problem we have, the existential problem that we have, is this sense of disconnect. And think about those days. Like I think about the days that where my phone doesn't work or there's a problem. They're some of the most peaceful days because you are suddenly disconnected from the technology that sort of is pervasive in our life, and you are forced to like reconnect with who you are as a human being. The days that you decide to pick up the phone rather than text someone, the days that you decide to kind of reconnect, that's the problem that we are encountering, is the ability to connect with ourselves and each other.
So do you think part of this, when we talk about a spiritual problems, that it in itself creates a bit of disconnect because people say, well, I don't believe in God, so I'm not spiritual. And then you have maybe even extreme religious views that, well, I'm religious, so I am spiritual. When in reality, there's a good likelihood that that person who is saying that they're an atheist is more spiritual than the person who is, claiming to be, insert faith.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's the problem, is the language. Like we were talking about this a little bit, that language can connect us, but language can divide us. And so that's where, when you use the word spiritual, but you're talking to an audience of people who consider themselves non-spirit, like what does it even mean to be non-spiritual? To me, it means like you're not necessarily connected to one particular faith, but that also means that you're non-denominational. I mean, you may be non-denominational, you may not be necessarily following one particular faith, but you may be consider yourself spiritual. And that's kind of obviously a big movement nowadays, is this sort of, kind of more Buddhist philosophy of kind of a mindfulness type of being in the present moment, being connected with others, being connected with something greater than yourselves. Is that person spiritual? Or if you don't use the word God in your language, are you non-spiritual? And I think that's a fundamental problem too. And perhaps maybe a better word to use could be human and humanity, because I think in the end, that's really where you want people to start having the conversations, is let's just take the language out of the equation for a second. That's why I think body language is such an interesting thing, because when we take words out of the equation as human beings, and you just start to think about, the days that you walk around and you meet people in the eyes, or you have open arms, the subtle little things that science has taught us, but like sort of help people connect. When you have issues like, emotional contagion, where someone comes into a room in a bad mood and it just massively spreads. I think like the nonverbal ways in which we communicate are almost more connective than sometimes having the kinds of, conversations about things that surround religion. But at the same time, I think they're important conversations to have, because, but I think I think where we get hung up sometimes is in our cognitive flexibility. That I think we are so rigid sometimes in our worldview, and it's not, I would say, necessarily like a fault. I think, you have this whole issue of like generational trauma, and you have this whole issue of like how people were brought up, and it's not even someone's specific worldview that they own. It's something that actually got passed down from generations. Like you look at bigotry and things like that. So it's like, at what point do people take responsibility for their own view and their own behavior, their personal responsibility, and at what point do you kind of, that's why I love like Adam Grant and a lot of the stuff he puts out there, including his book Think Again, and this whole idea of like, don't just be so married to dogmatic views of like, this is how life is, this is how other people are. How many times have we all been blown away by the assumptions we make about other people? I mean, there's so many examples that, that's what I think I love about the story of Jesus, whether you believe someone like him exists or not, is let's just say there's but the whole idea of like stirring things up and illustrating to people these tensions that, whether it's like the meek shall inherit the earth, or whether it's like love your neighbor, but like if you have enemies, almost like love them more. Like this sort of tension of, you know, maybe don't be thinking about things as there's such an us versus them mentality. And it's born out of evolution. I mean, if you were apart from the group, you were more likely to die. And so people are going to want to join a larger group. But the problem is that if you have other groups that have fundamental different ideologies, it's like we go back to tribal warfare. And in some ways, that's kind of what's happening nowadays in parts of the world, or even in conference rooms. I mean, like I even see in our own medical group, and again, I don't pretend to know really anything more than anyone else. It's just, I think as doctors, we have a very sacred space that we work where if we really pay attention to what people do, they open themselves up to us in a way with vulnerability that, really only people who like, priests or other types of occupations have. I had a gentleman the other day who I actually knew personally through my son's school, but then he decided to come to me as a patient. And what I saw about the guy in the context of school was someone who was kind of like tough and had it all together. And he broke down in my office about some medical issues that he had. And I just thought to myself, I'm like, it's only because I do what I do that I had this powerful sacred moment with him, but it showed me a totally different side of him. And I think that, that's where, but it's not unique to being doctors. I think we just took a moment to really just sit and listen to people and see that we have so much more in common. Like some of the best conversations I've had, one of my mental health professionals that I see, he's an atheist, but we have these conversations about how spirituality has helped my mental health. And so it's a really fascinating discussion that we have because he approached it from the standpoint of neuroscience. He comes at from a standpoint of psychology and neuroscience in explaining the things that help me. He says, Asim, if you want to use spirituality as a way in which you navigate and cope with life, that's great. And I think that's the thing to some degree that we need to just understand about each other. Some people use spirituality, some people don't, but it's ways in which we make sense of ourselves in the world.
So for those of us coming from a scientific or evidence-based background, how do you reconcile or explore this intersection between science and spiritual or existential questions?
I think it gets back to that faith and doubt idea. So if you think about scientists and you think about the scientific method and the null hypothesis, there's so much doubt, right, built into scientists. I mean, that's really what a lot of science is sort of making assumptions and trying to either prove them right or wrong. But doubt is built into it. You don't just like sort of, I mean, you see so many examples of this in science over the centuries. Like people make assumptions about things and then they try to prove those assumptions wrong. Well, I think that that's the challenge in spirituality, and especially in organized religion, is that so much dogma gets created that it removes some of that certainty, and I think it removes some of that uncertainty. And I think that's where the tension between spirituality and science exists. Is that I think perhaps people in the realm of science see spiritual individuals as people who are not questioning, who are just accepting as sort of dogma that, Jesus is the only way. And that, I think for me, that's where I wrestle, because if I think that Christianity is the only way to go, how do I reconcile where my parents are both passed? Does that mean they're in hell? Like, so I have a very difficult, I think, and that's probably what I, sort of not kind of typical in that school of thought because, and I'm not sure if I have the answers. Does that make me not Christian because I have a challenge with that? And I think that that's where some of that tension you look at scientists, for example, like there are probably millions of scientists that follow certain religious traditions. Does that mean they're not a scientist? And then you have, and so I think that you're seeing this more and more where scientists and spiritual leaders are trying to find places of overlap. And I think it does come down to the fact that faith and doubt exist in science and exist in spirituality, and they're necessary parts of both because even a scientist, deep down, say, even an atheist, probably deep down is wondering, could I have it wrong? Could I be wrong? I mean, I'm going down this route of there may be no God. But then the person who is religious is probably, to some degree, maybe having that same idea. Could I be wrong? Because the reality is that we can't prove some of these things. Like, for example, having faith is sort of the belief in something that you can't physically prove. And again, some of it gets down to like how we have evolved in our lives. So for me, like I had this major trauma growing up as a kid. And then when I was still young, when I was just in my early 20s, my dad just disappeared. And it was painfully traumatic and I had to make sense of it. And so, and I kept searching. And I searched within Hinduism and I couldn't get that answer. And I searched within science. I mean, I went through many years not believing in God. Like how could any of this happen? And I think what ultimately drew, and then I think then it gets into the area of miracles, okay? And you can talk about small miracles or big miracles. I know even in the cath lab, I know even with my patients, like there are moments in procedures, there are times in people's outcomes where I fully can't explain why they got better. I mean, we see this in cancer medicine all over the place, that you even see within oncology literature that a person's mindset is an independent predictor of their outcome. You have, but then see, that's where you have to be careful because then you have this whole realm of pseudoscience and you have this whole realm of like, you know, if I believe enough that I will be able to heal myself. And I'm not disputing that, but I'm just saying that again, it gets back to the fact that it is important to have doubt and it is important to have skepticism. I think that that is part of being human and that people on kind of both sides of the equation, scientists and spiritual leaders, probably have that within, whether they want to admit it to their colleagues or not. There is probably some element of that because in the end, like, how can any of us prove with 100% certainty that quote unquote we're right about how the universe is, how people
Well, I
are?
think both science and faith rely on a certain lack of certainty. I mean, scientists should not ever
Mhm.
be absolute. And I tell my students all the time that,
Right.
do not use the word proven in a, literature review paper with me because I'm going to mark it up because nothing is proven. We deal in
Mm.
probabilities. Science is probabilities,
Right.
the likelihood that we are making a right or wrong decision. And faith is the same thing. I mean, we cannot be dogmatic about, our vision of God because we have not seen God. And the wild
Right.
thing is that, when you read in the Bible, if we were to see God, it would just kind of destroy us because it's just all too powerful.
Yeah.
And so we're not even capable of embracing the fullness of it all. And so I love that tension between science and faith because I'm kind of like you. I was a geology major before I became an exercise scientist. And I got to a point like early in my college career, it's like I'm taking geology classes, we're learning about evolution. It's not consistent with, my religious teaching. Do I have to accept evolution and
Mhm.
deny my faith? Or do I have to deny evolution and, kind of look like a fool because it's pretty obvious that, all that evidence is there. And really, once I found that as you look at the story of Genesis, and I don't have to embrace it as being a literal 7 days, that fits
Right.
very closely with the whole, process of
Right.
creation of the earth or the development of the earth. And so to me, faith has always been this continual growth process that, revealing new understanding, exploring new ideas, understanding that God is so much bigger than I could even comprehend. And so it's almost impossible for me to deny anybody else's perception of God because they're just looking at God from a different angle. And in those who are
Exactly.
atheist or non-believers, they may be looking at the same thing that I'm calling God and just having a different view, different word for it, different perspective of it.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, I remember hearing a pastor talk about the Bible. It's a collection of stories, right? I mean, it's not like there's one author, right? And so there are certain themes that are interwoven that repeat themselves, whether it's Old Testament, New Testament. But then there's also this pastor was talking about how when you look at some of the language of a given chapter or verse, it's written for people at that time. It's written for the audience at that time. So that's why you have to be careful about taking word for word something out of the Bible and directly applying it to modern day audiences. And you have to look at what is the underlying meaning that's there. And I think again, one of the things that Jesus Christ represented was attention. I love this. I love this miniseries, The Chosen. I really kind of gotten into that lately, and one of the things about The Chosen miniseries following the apostles and the relationship with Jesus is that they have several consultants on the show. Like they have a Catholic priest. I know there's a couple of other religious spiritual traditions they have on the show. I'm not sure if they have one from the scientific realm or atheist, but I think that one of the things I was reading about is that people who are non-Christian enjoy watching the show. And one of the reasons why they enjoy watching the show is that they see the humanity of what these producers and writers are trying to portray is not necessarily this is a series about Jesus, but what it's trying to represent is that things are just not as black and white. I mean, life is in the gray. I mean, to me, like if you look at neuroscience and psychological science, there are things called cognitive distortions. So we as human beings have them. And one of the reasons we have them is, again, to help us make sense of the world. It's based on evolutionary survival mechanisms that were designed for us to like not get killed by a saber-toothed tiger. But we're unfortunately using that to apply to modern day, when we're talking about like who's right or wrong in a political debate. But in the end, cognitive distortions, one of the biggest ones is black and white thinking. How can you be so 100% sure? And scientists are the first to say, good scientists, or I shouldn't say even good, like, see, I'm using the word good, like good and bad. But but then you have to be careful because, it really gets into like these deep philosophical questions like, is there really good and evil? And what is evil? Like, and what is sin? Like some view sin. I think a lot of people are turned off from faiths such as Christianity because of this notion that we are this idea that maybe we're fundamentally flawed, that we have sinned and it's about repenting sin. I remember listening to a pastor once, and I loved the way he kind of viewed sin. That technically, and I think it's either I'm probably getting this wrong, but it's either the Greek basis of the word, but maybe it's hamartia, I think, but it's missing the mark. So I think that that's perhaps really what we're talking about is being so dogmatic about something that you lose sight of the bigger picture, that you are so because that's where I was hearing this lecture about how certainty is almost one of the biggest sins, in the sense that it makes you blind. It makes you blind to other viewpoints. And if we want to get nerdy about it, I think of the 12 lead electrocardiogram being a cardiologist. Each of those leads, each of those sets of electrodes is looking at the heart's electrical system from a different viewpoint. So in one set of leads, it can look like someone's having a myocardial infarction, but in another set of leads, it can show you that they're actually not. And in one set of leads, you may think the person is out of rhythm, but in another set of leads, it shows that they're actually, in fact, in rhythm. So it's really, And, science has these examples all the time of like the observer effect, right? And how you can have, there's inherent biases. We have cognitive distortions and we have cognitive biases, right? Like as human beings, that if I am really into Christianity right now, I'm going to see God everywhere. But if I'm really into like reading something about science, or I'm really wanting to buy a new car, I'm going to see that everywhere, right? So I think that's the thing, kind of like what you said, Jeff, is that, there is so many, not even in Christianity, but there's in a lot of faiths, this whole idea that like our brains are, I mean, we are not to the point that we can really even fully understand what God is or who God is or if there is a God 100% certainty. That's why a lot of times what's talked about are the attributes of God, like the fruits of the Spirit. I mean, this is talked about a lot. How do you live a righteous life? I mean, righteous is even kind of a loaded word. But how do you live a life that is sort of like, to me, I think one of my favorite quotes was sort of what Gandhi said, which was, happiness is really where what you think, what you say, and what you do are in alignment. So I think living a life of alignment, living a life where you really try to better understand your values that you have and like living in alignment with those values. So I think one of our jobs as people, and perhaps something that we try to teach our kids, is you know taking personal responsibility for your actions, for your words. That how often have we seen words cause major conflicts over the centuries? And I think that that's really where, like, it gets back to the idea of being disconnected versus connected. And I think, you look at something like the pandemic. So while there was so much disconnection going on, you also saw people from both sides of the aisle in Congress. You saw people all over the place working together because they had a common quote unquote enemy. And there's nothing like having something that people are all trying to work against, or people who are trying to work to solve a problem, probably a better way of looking at it, that brings people together. So, unfortunately, sometimes it takes major things that happen to the planet, whether it's climate crisis or whatever it is, that brings people together. And I think that it's soon no one's fault. I mean, we all have very complex lives, right? Like, I don't know what the rest of your day looks like. I don't know anything about your personal life and vice versa. But we're meeting at a point of connection on this podcast right now. And so I think that that's where, to me, the spiritual problem, getting back to kind of the theme of this podcast, is really that we need to keep ourselves more open-minded, cognitively flexible, emotionally agile in how we regulate our emotions. I think that's really where we can have deeper conversations. And it is a continued conversation until the day we die. That there is even using the word like there's always going to be doubt, that's a dogmatic statement. Like, so that's, I think that's where a lot of organized religion people tend to get turned off, because they feel or they sense that they're being told something that they have to believe. That again, this idea of an us versus them. If you're following, if you're going to a church or a mosque or what have you, and you're getting the sense when you leave that sermon that there's an us versus them mentality, I would just say that's where you want to be cautious, because how can one be so sure that their way is the only way? Now, that goes in sort of contradiction, maybe to some degree, than the statement that Jesus makes, that he's the way, the truth, and the life. Like, what did he mean by that? Do you mean like that's the only way to get to heaven? How do I reconcile that with my parents? Where are they then? If they were not Christian, where are they? Well, in Hinduism, we believe in the cycle of, birth and death and renewal, and the cycle of life and reincarnation. But it's not as simplistic as people think. Like, I remember growing up, and people would sort of tease me and say, well, your parents are Hindu. Does that mean they believe they're going to come back as a grasshopper if they didn't do things right in their life? I mean, the sort of very distorted, ignorant view of karma and dharma and some of these other principles. But I think that, again, to me, you look at to some degree, what is the end result of different philosophical views of the world and ourselves? Like that's what matters more in many cases than the specific belief you have. Because again, and that's a lot of what was trying to be sent out in a message in the Bible or in the Quran is really this idea of there's this peace garden in our hospital that I often go to. So the hospital chapel and the peace garden are down the hall from the cath lab. So for the longest time, I would have tremendous anxiety as I was scrubbing for procedures. And I've been a cardiologist for over 19 years. And to this day, even on a simple case like a pacemaker or something, I still have a level of anxiety. And I've learned through some cognitive processing therapy and trying to deal with some of the traumas that I've had that a lot of that is built around this fear of my dad, like my dad dying suddenly and me feeling like it is my responsibility on that person on the table to keep that person alive. And so a lot of the anxiety and the feelings of lack of control kind of come into play. But I have to hold it together. I have to compartmentalize. I have to do my job. And what I found over time for me is going to the hospital chapel and praying for my patients and praying for God to give me guidance in the procedure has made a big difference in my ability to do the procedure. I'm much calmer. I'm much more centered. I'm much less flustered. So a non-spiritual person would probably say, or scientists may say, well, that's good. You're using a belief construct system to help you navigate feelings and emotions of anxiety and panic that you're using spirit. In the end, that's good. It doesn't matter whether that's right or wrong. It makes me a better doctor. And patients love hearing that story, by the way. When they hear, I've had so many patients like want to pray with me before. And I remember, when I was Hindu, quote unquote, before I became Christian, I remember being totally turned off to that. That's the irony of God in my life, is that I was so black and white about it that if I was Hindu, I remember my first wife kind of grew up in this very Orthodox family. And I remember her roommate in college was Baptist, and she always felt like her roommate was trying to convert her. And so I grew up in my first marriage with this notion that anyone, like my mind went to a black and white space. Like anyone started talking to me about Christianity, I don't want to talk to them because they're going to try to convert me and they're going to say I'm going to hell. It's so amazing how we just develop these massive cognitive black and white distortions. And it wasn't until I saw for myself that things are just not that black and white. And there is an allowance, that like I even find the whole fundamental aspect of Christianity and the Abrahamic religions is just like, if you really think about it, I remember visiting Jerusalem, and I'm like, there's so much conflict amongst Jews, Muslims, and Christians in the world, but in this one city, they all have to figure out how to live together because that's their next door neighbor. And so somehow they have to figure out because they're living in the same space. And I remember going to visit the building where the Last Supper was, and the Last Supper was on the second floor, and it's now a Muslim shrine. And King David's tomb was underneath the first floor. And if there is no greater example of paradox and the coexistence of truth. And I think, maybe I should have said it earlier in the conversation, but this idea that you can have coexisting truths exist, but there is the ability, and we have a very difficult time holding that idea that you can actually have two true things that appear opposite, like faith and doubt, that can actually coexist. And that's where I think in that great place between the black and white, that is where we need to spend more time sitting with that discomfort and wrestling with it, because there's stories throughout the Bible or in many other religious traditions of people wrestling with doubt. And scientists wrestle with doubt all the time. And that's what makes them good scientists, just as you said, when you talk to your students. If you are like when I trained people, residents, fellows, interns, I would tell them that one of the most dangerous things is thinking that you can do everything yourself. And one of the best qualities you can develop as a physician is having the humility and the vulnerability to know when to ask for help, because none of us can figure everything out. I had a very low threshold to if I'm not sure about something, I'll call one of my colleagues out there. I'll say, hey, what do you think about this? Can you take a look at this tracing that I'm seeing in the cath lab right now on this ablation procedure? Or I have colleagues at UCLA and UC San Diego and Scripps out in California where I'll have a complex case. I'll say, I I know what's going on, but I don't quite know the next step. And I'll either call them up and get their advice, or maybe I'll even refer the patient. Does that make me a bad doctor? No, I think it's understanding your limits.
So for our listeners who might be struggling with their own kind of sense of purpose in meaning, what's one small step that they can take today to start addressing that?
That's great. I'm all about micro steps. Read. I think reading is one of the most undervalued, but most powerful things that you can do for your worldview, your cognitive flexibility, and for you to better make sense of yourself. And so I would say pick something to read that you would never read. So if one of your listeners is Christian, pick up a copy of the Quran or look at it in a bookstore. Or I would say if one of your listeners is an atheist, pick up or read an article. I mean, some of the stuff is free online. Like read different, views. But I would say a good place to start is with one of the great books. A good place to start is with people who have a wide level of respect throughout history. And, even in modern day, like a good place to start is with some of Adam Grant's stuff, like Think Again. Like I think what I would say is the next step is you want to figure out ways to create more cognitive flexibility and enhance your worldview. And that is what's going to start the process. But it doesn't have to be reading. The next step is doing something today. Like maybe it's just deciding not to talk as much and just listen to people. Like that's a really easy next step because you learn like so much more than when you, and it's from the Bible, be quick to listen and slow to speak. So, I mean, that's a good kind of philosophy.
So as we wrap up today, is there anything else that we haven't really talked about that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Maybe I end with a question for you, and then perhaps that'll give me some guidance on what to say next. What is your goal of the podcast for your listeners? Like what is the one thing you want people to walk away with?
That is a really great question. And I think the goal is for us to come together, and I think it seems like a very lofty, kind of superficial goal, but, we are so disconnected in our world. And, as I go down my own faith journey and, I know, you've had, a very different journey, and in many ways we're at the same place right now, but we're, probably also at different places. And, I see the faith journey is almost like a puzzle. We all have different perspectives, different pieces that we can put into that puzzle. And until we get all the pieces put together, it's almost impossible to see really what the puzzle is all about. And so I think that's my real goal here, is just to get other perspectives, maybe kind of selfishly, for me to grow, for me to kind of find my path a little bit more directly. But really I don't know if I have specific goals in mind other than just to, start to understand that there's a world and a universe bigger than ourselves, and whether we view that as just God or the universe itself, or just the presence of other people, that all of that matters. And it doesn't matter if you believe differently than me, or if I believe differently than you, or if we believe the same thing, but maybe we have slightly different connections within our own faith systems. I mean, look at Christianity. There's so many different denominations.
Right. Exactly.
And, just how can we find that commonality to come together to begin to solve the major problems of our world? And that's why I like that you brought up that spiritual might not be the best word, but it's also the best word, because I want to create that tension and that discussion around the theme of what is spirituality and how do we address the problems of the world as a collective people, rather than just trying to solve them with the same solutions that we've been using year after year after year, decade after decade, and so on.
Yeah, I think, and even my wording of it was probably not the most accurate. For me to say spirituality is not the best word, I would say spirituality is probably the closest word that we can come to some of the issues that we're talking about, but it doesn't fully reflect really what we're trying to get to, because I don't think there's a word that necessarily exists other than to say something like shared humanity.
Yeah.
What are the points of shared humanity that we have? But I would leave also the listeners with something to just kind of think about. Again, the overlap between spirituality and science. Quantum mechanics and quantum physics is kind of a good place for that. So if you think about the Christianity, the Trinity of Christianity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, how can you have God exist in three different forms at the same time? In the same way, like even in Hinduism, you have Brahma, Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, creation, maintaining, and destruction, this cycle. And in other traditions, you can have, various kinds of coexisting truths, so coexisting beliefs that one is not right or the other. And then you have in quantum physics, quantum mechanics, you have the idea of superposition, that you can have a particle exist in multiple different states at the same time. So I think that to leave your listeners with this notion that you can have coexisting truths, so that when you're talking, when you have a Christian talking to someone who is Muslim, talking to someone who's Jewish, talking to someone who's Hindu, there is some level of coexisting truth there and overlap. And our jobs are to find it. Our jobs are to, and the only way, one of the ways to find it is by, very difficult to do, and I'm not good at it, is speaking less and listening more. And trying to, and that's why I love the idea of beginner's mind, the idea of being curious. I think curiosity is probably one of the best antidotes for dogma and absolute certainty, is having a curious mindset of saying, I never thought about it that way. And maybe people like the idea of the 12 EKG, that helps me, but things can be viewed very differently depending on where you're standing. And always remembering that we are so complex as human beings, that the words that come out of someone's mouth, remember, are influenced by a lot of things: generation, nature and nurture, genetics, how they're feeling that day. I mean, a great example is like if someone's in a bad mood, that could range from anything from being in a fight with their spouse to being constipated to having food poisoning to, I mean, like this could be this whole, or from dying from cancer. So just remember that what we see in each other is like a very small glimpse of what's actually going on at a deeper level. It's kind of the idea of an iceberg. And there's a lot going on beneath the waters that we may not know, and we will never know unless we actually pause enough to ask questions and be curious. And, that's, I think, to some degree, a lot of what's happening, in this podcast is to say, to someone who doesn't believe in God versus someone who believes in God, what drew you to that belief system? I mean, you started the episode today asking me that question, like, what drew me to this? I think it's because I grew up, I am a scientist as a physician, but I also know I can't explain everything with science. And I know that in my own life, I have seen miracles happen, or times in which I should not have survived something, and I did. And I can't put it together with just chance. And I've seen it happen way too many times in patients. And I would just say to your listeners, there's going to be a day that all of us die, and you have to really be thinking about how, and this is kind of like a nice idea in Stoicism philosophy, that you have to kind of imagine that worst case scenario. And what are you going to be feeling in that ICU when you know it's your time? Or, what are you going to be feeling when you lose a loved one? Like, how are you going to make sense of that? And how are you going to embrace the fear that will likely develop and the fear of the unknown and uncertainty? To me, it's helpful to have a North Star, to have a guiding light, to have some point of truth in my life, of absolute truth for me. I'm not going to impose that absolute truth on someone else. But for me, like to get me through a complex cardiac procedure where someone can die on the table, I don't just want to be self-reliant. I want to be able to say, there is someone, and in my case, it's Jesus, but there is someone that I can call on for help that is going to help see me through it, and know that regardless of the outcome of that procedure, I'm going to be okay with it. Because as doctors, it's very easy to take on a lot of responsibility when there are negative outcomes. And I think people really do forget that, how much of an emotional and mental toll that can weigh on you when you feel that responsibility. So for me, it's helpful to share that responsibility with something greater than myself.
Well, thank you for sharing all that today and with our listeners and viewers. I don't want to say much more because I think that's where I want to leave the end of these episodes, is with something for people to think about and to bring them to the next episode as we keep exploring spirituality and how it intertwines with our belief systems and how it can help us come together to solve the problems of the world. And so thank you again to the listeners and viewers. Click that like button, subscribe, and we'll see you the next time as we solve the spiritual problems that we have in this world. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.